Have you ever thought about like maybe, those kind of nagging feelings, like the frustration when things just don't go our way, the anxiety that kind of bubbles up, or even like just that general sense of like something being, I don't know, a little off. Like what if they're not just random glitches? What if they're actually like fundamental aspects of how we're wired? And today we're digging into some pretty fascinating material that you shared with us. Specifically, this book called "Painful Intelligent: What AI Can Tell Us About Human Suffering." And if you're anything like me, you're always looking for a clearer way to understand some of these like big ideas without getting lost in the technical jargon. I think you're gonna really love this one.
Yeah, I think you're right. You can forget your typical self-help books or even like purely theoretical philosophy. What makes this exploration so unique is its fresh perspective. It uses the principles of, artificial intelligence, like how we design systems to think and learn, as a way to understand those core processes that might drive our own mental experiences, including why we experience suffering. Think of it as using AI as a computational lens to really zoom in, on the human mind.
Yeah, exactly. And the author even mentions that they wrote the kind of book they wish they had access to as a student. And it's all driven by this central question, isn't it? Like, could it be that evolution in its own way, made some basic design choices in building us that inevitably lead to these feelings of, frustration, fear, and even dissatisfaction? And can we learn something about those evolutionary blueprints by looking at how we build AI?
Precisely. The core question compels us to, consider if our fundamental makeup, which has been shaped by evolution to prioritize things like survival and reproduction, might inherently contain trade-offs. Even what we might perceive as flaws that manifest as suffering. And the book proposes that by examining the computational principles we employ in AI, we can gain a much deeper understanding of how those same principles might be at play in our own brains.
Okay, so where do we even begin to like unravel this? The book kicks off with this big concept of the brain as a computer. And now hold on, I know what you might be thinking, like my brain doesn't need a system update, but this is more of an analogy about function, right?
Absolutely. The analogy isn't about the physical hardware, like circuit boards and chips. It's about the underlying function. Your brain takes in information, processes it, and uses the results of that processing to achieve certain goals. Goals that, from an evolutionary standpoint, are ultimately geared towards, passing on our genes. The book makes the point that any system that processes information in this way, in a very abstract sense, can be considered a computer.
Okay, I get that. It's about what it does, but the book also emphasizes a key difference between our brains and like traditional computers, right? My brain isn't just one single processor crunching all the numbers.
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction. Unlike your computer with its central processing unit, your brain uses parallel and distributed processing. Think of it as billions of neurons, each performing relatively simple calculations independently and all at the same time. It's a massively interconnected and simultaneous system. But but the critical point for you to understand is that if we're asking like why certain computations happen, why you feel a certain emotion or make a particular decision, the underlying physical structure, while important, isn't the complete picture. The logic of the computation itself exists beyond the specific biological machinery.
So it's less about the biological wires and more about the underlying code in a way. And the book draws this really interesting parallel between, how we humans program AI with specific goals in mind, and how evolution has, in a sense, programmed us to maximize our chances of genetic success.
That's a key insight for you. Just as an AI is designed by humans to achieve, specific objectives, we humans have been shaped by evolution to, as the book puts it, maximize the number of copies of our genes that make it into the next generation. This evolutionary programming is what drives our most fundamental needs and goals.
Which leads to this slightly unsettling idea that, maybe your deepest desires and motivations aren't entirely your own conscious choices. They're sort of baked in by this evolutionary imperative. So okay, we've got the brain as a goal-oriented information processor programmed by evolution. So where does suffering fit into this picture? The book introduces this idea of frustration pretty early on.
Yes, frustration is presented as a core mechanism of suffering for you. The book defines it as arising when an intelligent agent operating with limited control over its environment and with imperfect knowledge fails to reach its goals. Think about an AI trying to navigate a complex virtual world and constantly bumping into walls or taking wrong turns. That failure to achieve its programmed objective leads to a kind of computational frustration.
And for us humans, that feeling of frustration can be pretty intense, right? Like think about, being stuck in traffic when you're already late.
Mhm.
And the book mentioned something about experience replay making it even worse. That sounds like overthinking gone wild.
Yeah. What's fascinating here for you is how the book connects this to information processing.
Yeah.
Experience replay refers to the way intelligent systems, including your brain, reprocess past experiences, especially errors, to learn from them and optimize future behavior. So, when you make a mistake or face a setback, your mind doesn't just, let it go. You tend to, revisit those moments, replaying them and potentially intensifying the unpleasant mental state associated with the initial frustration. It's like the mental equivalent of watching the replay of that embarrassing moment over and over again.
So it's not just the initial disappointment when something goes wrong, but your brain like reliving it, that can really sting.
All right.
And the book also makes this distinction between two meanings of frustration, right? So like the actual failure of a plan, and then the negative feeling that comes with it.
Exactly for you. There's the objective outcome, the plan didn't work, and then the subjective experience, the feeling of being frustrated or annoyed or even angry. Both are important aspects of this, core mechanism of suffering for you.
Now, actually getting a plan to work in the first place can be really tricky, right? The book talks about the computational difficulty of planning, especially, when you have a lot of options. Suddenly, my daily commute with all its possible routes feels like a major computational feat.
It really is in a way. The book illustrates this by pointing out that the number of possible sequences of actions can grow exponentially, even with a relatively small number of choices at each step. Think about trying to navigate the Paris public transport system with all the different lines, connections, and possible routes. The sheer number of possibilities explodes very quickly.
Okay, I could definitely relate to that feeling of being overwhelmed by options. So how do we even manage to make plans? The book mentions heuristics as shortcuts.
Heuristics are essentially rules of thumb or mental shortcuts that help you make decisions and plans without having to consider every single possibility. They allow you to find, reasonable solutions in a computationally efficient way, even when faced with complex problems. Think of always taking the same route to work because it's, usually pretty reliable, even if there might be a slightly faster way, sometimes.
Makes sense. We can't analyze every single bus route in Paris, so we rely on our past experiences and general knowledge to guide us. The book also defines desire as this computational process that suggests goals to your planning system.
Yeah.
But it notes that you don't always act on
Yeah.
every desire. Thank goodness for that.
That's a crucial distinction for you. Desire arises as a kind of internal signal suggesting a potential goal. But your planning system then has to evaluate that desire in the context of, other desires, available resources, and potential consequences. You can have conflicting desires, and you need to, choose which ones to pursue.
And the book explains that committing to a single plan is important because, constantly switching between different goals would be incredibly computationally expensive. It's like trying to run multiple complex programs on your computer at the same time. It bogs everything down.
Precisely for you. Once you start down a particular path, abandoning it, too easily in favor of a new goal would waste all the computational effort you invested in developing the initial plan. So commitment, even when new temptations arise, is a computationally sound strategy for you.
Now let's shift gears a bit. The book talks about learning as this process of minimizing errors, and it links this back to suffering, specifically, frustration. This sounds a bit counterintuitive. Isn't making mistakes just part of learning?
It is, but the book argues that the computational mechanisms underlying learning are often tied to the signaling of errors for you. In AI, for example, many learning algorithms work by trying to reduce the difference between their predictions and the actual outcomes. This error signal is what drives the adjustments in the system for you. So, in a way, learning requires those moments of not getting it right, and that feeling of not getting it right is often what you experience as suffering.
And the book uses, neural networks as an example. And for those of us who aren't, AI experts, can you give us a quick rundown of what those are and how they learn? Sure. Think of neural networks as complex systems made up of many interconnected artificial neurons arranged in layers for you. These neurons perform, simple pattern matching computations on their inputs and pass the results to the next layer. And through many such layers and millions of these connections, the network can, learn to perform very sophisticated tasks like recognizing images or recommending products. And learning happens by adjusting the weights of these connections based on the errors in the network's outputs for you. So just like these AI systems learn by constantly tweaking their internal connections based on errors, your brain is also constantly adjusting your mental models based on your experiences of not getting it right. And that feeling of not getting it right is often what you experience as suffering. So it's like fine tuning all these tiny knobs to get the right answer. And the book mentions these algorithms called gradient descent and stochastic gradient descent. Those sound very technical.
At a high level for you, these are iterative algorithms, meaning they repeat a process over and over to find the settings, the weights in the neural network that minimize the error. Think of it like an AI trying to find the best settings by repeatedly making small adjustments based on its mistakes.
Yeah.
Until it finds a sweet spot. This iterative process of error correction is fundamental to how AI learns, and in a way it mirrors how you learn from your own experiences of things not going as planned.
Okay, I'm getting the picture. The book also compares this optimization process of machine learning to biological evolution. What's the key difference there?
The crucial difference for you is that in machine learning, the programmer explicitly defines the error function.
Yeah.
The thing the AI is specifically trying to minimize. In biological evolution, there's no programmer. The equivalent of the error function is fitness. The complex outcome of how well an organism survives and reproduces in its environment. And unlike a programmer who can, directly calculate the error, fitness can only be observed after the fact by seeing who survives and who doesn't. So evolution is more of a trial and error process with the feedback coming from the environment itself.
Now, let's dive deeper into this idea of frustration and error. The book introduces this concept of reward prediction error. What's that all about?
Reward prediction error, or RPE for you, is the difference between the reward an intelligent agent expects to receive and the reward it actually receives. It's a fundamental concept in reinforcement learning, a type of AI where agents learn through trial and error by receiving rewards or penalties. Think about an AI that expects a point for reaching a certain location in its virtual world. If it gets the point, that's 0 RPE. If it expects a point but it gets 2, that's a positive RPE, better than expected. If it expects a point but gets none, that's a negative RPE.
So if an AI expects a virtual treat and doesn't get it, that's a negative RPE, and that feels like our everyday experience of disappointment. The book even says this is linked to frustration.
Yeah, exactly for you. A negative RPE signals that things didn't go as expected, which aligns perfectly with your understanding of frustration. Conversely, a positive RPE, where the agent gets more reward than expected, can be linked to feelings of surprise or pleasure. And the book also emphasizes that repeated frustration or negative RPE is actually necessary for learning. If there were never any errors, the system wouldn't have any signal to adjust its behavior. You need to know when you're getting it wrong to learn how to get it right.
Makes sense. The book also talks about state value and action value functions in reinforcement learning as ways to learn, heuristics and plan. That sounds like the AI trying to figure out the best way to get its rewards.
Precisely. State value functions estimate the total future reward an agent can, expect starting from a particular state. And action value functions, on the other hand, estimate the total future reward an agent can expect by taking a specific action in a specific state. These functions act as learned heuristics for you, guiding the agent towards actions and states that are, likely to lead to higher rewards in the long run, thus aiding in planning.
And the book contrasts, frustration based on not reaching a specific goal with frustration arising from errors in these predictions. So, it's not just about failing to achieve, what you set out to do, but also about your expectations being wrong.
Right. Or you can be frustrated because your plan to reach a goal failed.
Yeah.
Or you can be frustrated because your prediction about how rewarding a certain action or outcome would turn out to be inaccurate. And the book also makes an interesting point about uncertainty increasing reward loss, even if the expected reward stays the same. That feeling of not knowing what's going to happen can be, more stressful than knowing something bad will happen for sure.
That resonates with me. The book then, delves into this concept of self and how it relates to threat and frustration. This feels like a really deep philosophical rabbit hole.
It is, but the book tries to approach it from a computational perspective for you. It introduces two key meanings of self relevant to suffering. First, the self as the target of long-term success evaluation. The part of you that's constantly assessing whether you're achieving your goals and improving yourself. Second, the self as the target of self-preservation, your fundamental survival
Sure.
instinct.
So if I'm not meeting my own expectations for success, that self-evaluation can lead to frustration, maybe even low mood or depression. And if I perceive a threat to my survival, that triggers another kind of suffering. The book even connects this this desire to be this instinct to survive to self needs and frustration, drawing a line all the way back to early Buddhist philosophy. That's a surprising connection.
What's fascinating is how these seemingly disparate ideas, computational goals, evolutionary drives, and philosophical concepts can be, linked through this framework. The book argues that even the early Buddhist understanding of suffering related to the self can be seen as a form of frustration related to these fundamental self needs.
Okay, let's talk more about threat. The book distinguishes it from typical frustration, saying it's more about the anticipation of negative outcomes. Now that tiger in the jungle example really stuck with me.
That example's that's a great illustration. When you encounter a tiger, you're not necessarily experiencing frustration from a failed plan or a missed reward. The suffering arises from the prediction of a future negative reward, the very real possibility of being harmed. Threats often involve a high degree of uncertainty about the exact outcome, but the potential for significant negative consequences is clear.
And the book brings up this idea of risk aversion, right? Our tendency to avoid uncertainty, especially when it comes to potential, threats. We often rather take a smaller, sure thing than gamble on a potentially larger reward with a risk of a big loss.
Exactly for you. This aversion to uncertainty, particularly in the context of threats, large negative rewards is a common phenomenon. The book also argues that even things like uncontrollability and unpredictability can can lead to frustration of your internal rewards related to feeling in control or certain if you feel like you can't influence what's happening or you can't anticipate the future, that in itself can be a source of distress.
This is all fitting together in a really interesting way. Now the book shifts to this idea of fast versus slow intelligence and how we categorize the world. It sounds like our intuitive thinking versus our more deliberate logical reasoning.
That's the essence of it for you. Dual process theory in psychology and in neuroscience describes two main modes of thinking, a fast, intuitive, and often unconscious system, and a slower, more deliberative and conscious system. The book draws parallels to AI, with neural networks representing the fast pattern matching system, and good old-fashioned AI, or GOF AI, which relies on logic and symbols, representing the slower, more rule-based approach.
And the book highlights the strengths of Jokovi in planning and flexibility. It can reason about abstract concepts and adapt to new situations based on logical rules.
Precisely. GoVai excels in areas where explicit reasoning and manipulation of symbols are important. However, the book then points out that the categories used in GoVai and even in your own thinking are often fuzzy, uncertain, and even arbitrary. Think about trying to define a word like big. There's no clear-cut boundary. What's big to an ant is tiny to an elephant.
Right, exactly. So these categories that help us generalize and communicate can also lead to, errors and even suffering. The snake rope example is classic.
That's a perfect illustration of how miscategorization can trigger a threat response and cause suffering. Thinking a rope is a snake leads to fear and anxiety. And this miscategorization highlights how your brain's efficient but sometimes inaccurate shortcuts can be a direct source of anxiety and suffering. The book explains that there are good computational reasons for this overgeneralization. It allows us to apply knowledge learned from one instance to other similar instances, which is generally efficient, but it can also lead to these kinds of errors.
Okay, so our brains are constantly processing information, making plans and categorizing the world, and all of this can lead to frustration and the anticipation of threats. But the book also talks about emotions and desires as interrupts. What does that mean?
The book proposes that emotions are not just feelings, but also information processing and signaling mechanisms. Think about fear again.
Yeah.
It captures your attention, interrupts whatever else you're doing, and triggers pre-programmed behaviors like fleeing, and desire functions similarly as an emotion, like suddenly grabbing your focus and suggesting a goal. Sometimes even overriding your more deliberate plans, so that intense craving for something can completely derail your intentions.
Right, exactly. And the book even says emotions can like hijack our minds and bodies, sometimes irrationally. And it connects, negative emotions to the pain system as a way to really grab our attention.
Yeah. Exactly. For you, the pain system is a very primal way for the brain to signal that something is wrong and needs immediate attention, and negative emotions by tapping into this system ensure that you prioritize dealing with potential threats or unmet needs. However, the book points out that these evolutionary dangers that trigger these interrupts, like snakes, might not align with the actual dangers we face in the modern world, like cars.
And if these interrupts are happening too often or are poorly calibrated, they can actually hinder our performance and well-being, right? You might get constantly stressed out by things that aren't real threats. But the book makes an interesting point that emotions, even though they feel irrational sometimes, actually contribute to optimal decision making given the limitations of our information processing. We can't always analyze every situation logically, so these quick emotional responses can be quite useful.
Precisely. Emotions provide fast, efficient responses in situations where slow, deliberative reasoning might be too slow or computationally expensive. They are a crucial part of your adaptive toolkit.
Now let's talk about those pesky wandering thoughts. My mind definitely has a life of its own sometimes. The book compares them to these emotional interrupts, saying they also reduce our mental control and can increase suffering.
Wandering thoughts, those thoughts that pop up when you're trying to focus on something else, do indeed share that characteristic of interrupting your ongoing mental activity for you. The book categorizes them into two main types: planning for the future and experience replaying past memories, often for learning. So when your mind drifts to that upcoming presentation or that awkward conversation from yesterday, that's your brain either trying to prepare or learn from the past.
Right. Exactly. And the book suggests that, planning during downtime can be useful, and this experience replay, even in reverse order, can help us update our knowledge efficiently. That's a clever computational trick.
It is for you by replaying sequences of events even in reverse, with a slight discount for events further in the past. Your brain can efficiently learn the value of different states and actions. However, the book also notes the potential for wandering thoughts to become, rumination, especially when you get stuck replaying negative experiences, which can definitely lead to a negative mood. And this is the big question: why do replaying negative experiences or constantly worrying about the future feel so unpleasant? The book suggests a computational design reason that using the pain system to broadcast error signals efficiently might make even these mental simulations feel like suffering. It's like your brain's way of making sure you pay attention to potential problems.
So it's like piggybacking on this existing, pain system. The the brain might have found a computationally efficient way to signal the importance of these internal simulations, even if the events themselves aren't actually happening in the present moment.
Exactly.
Which leads us to, this idea that our perception of the world isn't just a passive recording of reality, but an active construction. The book emphasizes that our sensory data is incomplete, and our brains are constantly filling in the gaps using, assumptions and prior information.
Exactly. Perception is a surprisingly difficult problem. Think about, visual perception. The amount of raw sensory data is enormous, and your brain has to figure out the 3D world from the 2D images projected onto your retinas. This is what's known as the inverse problem. There are often multiple possible causes for the same sensory input.
So our brains are constantly weighing the likelihood of different interpretations based on both the current sensory data and our past experiences, which are embodied in the weights of our neural networks, right?
Yeah.
And this process of inference is often, unconscious and automatic. However, the book points out that this constructive nature of perception means that our perceptions are inherently uncertain and subjective. And sometimes, as with visual illusions like the Kinesis triangle, they can even be wrong. And this has a crucial implication for suffering, because even your perception of reward loss, that feeling of missing out, is also based on this uncertain and subjective process of inference. It might even be illusory. Exactly. Now let's move on to this idea of distributed processing in the brain, and how it leads to limited control. Right? This feels related to those wandering thoughts and emotional interrupts we were just talking about.
Absolutely. Your brain's parallel and distributed nature with its billions of independently processing neurons inherently limits the control any single part can have over the entire system. There's no single central executive in charge of everything like a CEO running a company. While you might have a feeling of conscious control, the book suggests this might arise from a strong correlation between your intentions and the outcomes rather than a single controlling entity. So that feeling of I decided to raise my arm might actually be a result of complex distributed processes aligning in a way that creates that sensation of agency.
Which leads to this even more mind bending idea, right? Like is consciousness itself an illusion? The book distinguishes between information processing and our subjective experience.
Yeah.
Those qualia, the redness of red, the feeling of pain.
That's the famous hard problem of consciousness. How do these subjective experiences arise from physical processes in the brain? The book touches on various theories linking consciousness to things like simulation, a global workspace in the brain, or specific neural structures. But it also raises the fundamental question of whether an AI performing similar computations would necessarily have conscious experience. And the book highlights the difficulty of studying subjective experience scientifically. You can measure brain activity, but you can't directly access someone else's, conscious experience. And it even suggests that self-awareness itself might be an illusion, a collection of sensory perceptions without a central me. This is all pretty radical stuff. The book uses the metaphor of virtual reality to describe, consciousness as an internal construct, a simulation created by by your brain.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The brain is a computer, frustration, planning, learning, reward, prediction, errors, self, threat, fast and slow thinking, categorization, emotions as interrupts, wandering thoughts, perception as construction, distributed processing, and even, the illusion of consciousness. The book then tries to bring all this together in an overview of suffering mechanisms, right?
Yes, Chapter 15 presents a high-level flowchart summarizing the key causes and mechanisms of suffering. It shows how external stimuli and internal simulations lead to, desires, expectations, and self-needs, which then interact with uncertainty, uncontrollability, and unsatisfactoriness. This interaction results in frustration and threat, which are amplified by wandering thoughts and the mind-body connection, ultimately leading to your conscious experience of suffering. The book highlights that reducing elements in the green boxes, wandering thoughts and self needs could be key to reducing suffering. It also points out this,